So this video here is a photo slideshow tour of the abandoned Milwaukee Road right-of-way, and this particular segment is between Plummer, Idaho and Rosalia, Washington, and one of the other towns it passes through is Teco, Washington. So this map here is kind of a general overview of the whole area. You have Spokane, Washington up on the left. You have Coeur d'Alene, Idaho on upper right, and then the three arrows point to the three towns that this tour covers. There is Plummer, Idaho on the east, Teco, Washington in the middle, Rosalia, Washington on the west. So here's the first area that I will be covering. This is Plummer, Idaho to Teco, Washington, and generally this is where the Milwaukee is starting to transition out of the mountainous Idaho area and into the flat rolling plains of the eastern Washington in an area called the Palouse. Now there's also a town of Palouse, but Palouse is the general term for this overall region. Alright, so the first photo here is in Plummer, Idaho, and it is taken at the operational end of track for the St. Mary's River Railroad. Now in this view we are looking east towards St. Mary's. We're in Plummer, and this photo was taken standing on the old siding. On the right, ending on the dirt berm, is the old main line, and on the left is an old UP St. Mary's interchange track. Now the interchange track and the siding both continue on west for a tiny bit, about 200 to 500 feet or so, although it's fairly obvious from this view that there hasn't been any movement past this gravel road here in quite some years. In fact, the switch for the interchange track and the siding has actually had the points and the switch stand removed. Now one thing that is very interesting to note about Plummer is that it is one of the few locations where the Milwaukee Road had installed continuous welded rail, or CWR. This view here is at the very end of the main line, and you can see that the main line is actually 133-pound CWR. Now CWR is quite rare on the Milwaukee Road. Most of their track, right up until the end of abandonment, was jointed. Although there were a few stretches, as this photo proves, that were actually relayed in the mid-70s with CWR. Okay, now just a little bit west past that gravel road, here is the siding poking its way up through the trees and the grass, and the little gravel path on the right in the shade is actually the old main line. Now my assumption here is that when St. Mary's picked up this stretch of railroad from the Milwaukee, they had intended to use the siding and the interchange track and this little stub here for switching moves in Plummer. However, it's apparent that that has not occurred for quite a long time. Now here is the absolute end of the track. Now this, of course, again is the siding. The main line is the gravel path on the right here. The arrow points to where the rail actually ends, and the rail on the other side ends at the same location. And this photo is looking east towards St. Mary's and standing at the approximate location of the switch for the siding and the main. So continuing west out of Plummer, here is the overall condition of the right-of-way. Geographically south of Plummer, or railroad west out of Plummer, you get to, there has been several spots along this stretch where the right-of-way is, the right-of-way is located on a tall fill, about 8-10 feet tall or so, and there are several spots in that fill where it's been bulldozed down for the installation of new roads and what have you. Now here's the right-of-way just east of Plummer, just west of Plummer, excuse me, the photo caption in here is wrong. This is west of Plummer looking east. The right-of-way goes through the trees here, and there's this earth berm to prevent use of the right-of-way. Now at this particular location there used to be an old steel girder bridge that crossed over the old Highway 95 here. And when this particular spot was widened a bit, the bridge and the concrete abutment on the east side were removed. Now turning around 180 degrees, we see the concrete abutment for the west side is still in place. And this bridge was in place for many years after the rails were pulled. Now continuing on just a few hundred more feet, the right-of-way crosses under Highway 95. This is the Highway 95 overpass 3 miles west of Plummer, and this is looking east. And turning around from there, the right-of-way continues again in through the forest. Here it's actually in use as an ATV trail, and I'm not sure if at this location the right-of-way is on private or public land. I think it's probably privately owned, but it's still fairly easy to walk down from the Highway 95 down to tunnel number 41. Now, tunnel number 41 is 2,559 feet long, completely concrete lined, and it bores through the hill at this location. Now, one thing that's interesting to note is that the UP line that ran from Plummer to Tico crossed over the Milwaukee Road just over this trestle. The right-of-way is actually just on top of this tunnel portal here. So, on the other side of the tunnel, after a few more miles, we get to, I hope I pronounced this right, Morway, Idaho, M-O-W-R-Y. Morway, I don't know. Anyways, this was the location of a passing siding as well as a couple of house tracks here. And it was a flag stop in the earlier years. This is 7 miles west of Plummer, Idaho, looking east towards Plummer. Now, one thing that's interesting to note is you'll see the burned field on the left. Now, the state of Idaho still allows farmers to burn their fields at the end of the season, and so in this area, it's very common to see the blackened fields. Here's the other side of the siding at Morway, 8 miles west of Plummer, and this is looking west towards Tico. And continuing on beyond that, we get to the Washington-Idaho border. Now here's the Idaho side, the right-of-way. It's not used except for maybe by ATVs and dirt bikes, not maintained. Turning around 180 degrees at this location, we come to the Washington side. And this is used, this is maintained, in a lot better condition. And the reason for this is that the Milwaukee Road right-of-way across the entire length of the state of Washington is actually preserved as the Milwaukee Road Corridor, otherwise known as the John Wayne Rail Trail. And this is a multi-use trail that stretches the entire length of the state, although most of this trail is actually, especially in the east side of the state, is very, very difficult to access and actually requires a special permit for a lot of it to access it. So, continuing on towards Tico, here 2 miles east of Tico, the right-of-way passes through numerous earthen cuts, and in the type of soil in the Palouse region here is very, very runny when it gets wet, and so over the years, it's been 30 plus years since the rails were pulled up. Over the years, the cut has slowly started to fill in here. This and other cuts over by Tico, although by my estimate, that's probably only like 3 or 4 feet deep. So, given that it's been 30 years, it's actually not too terribly bad. 1 mile east of Tico, here we go through another cut, although this one is in a lot better shape. And the next little stretch that we will be looking at here is Tico to this tiny little town, middle of nowhere place called Pandora. And so here's the map here for that. It, the right-of-way just generally makes pretty straight line, although it from Tico goes out to Pine Creek and then follows Pine Creek down to Rosalia. So, in Tico, one of the first things that you'll notice is this very long, very tall steel trestle that spans the valley. Now, the Union Pacific also ran through Tico, and while the Union Pacific chose to locate their line in the valley floor, the Milwaukee, being the Milwaukee of course, chose to locate up on the hills and avoid all the grades that would have gone up and down, out in and out of the valley. Now, one thing that's interesting to note is that the horse corral and, in fact, this photo location are all located on the former Union Pacific yards. You'll see the on the trestle, most of the vertical supports are towers, except for there's the one single steel bent, and that's actually where the trestle crossed over the UP yards. Now, on this trestle, the State of Washington Department of Natural Resources has actually removed the deck and ties from each end of the trestle for about 50 feet and welded on a few feet out on the bridge girders, has welded on a piece of sheet metal. Now, while the main structure of the trestle is still in place, this sheet metal here is actually to prevent people from walking out onto the deck, which, having not seen maintenance in over 30 years, personally, I wouldn't want to venture out on this wooden deck myself. Although, if you're extremely brave and or extremely stupid, you probably could get out there. Again, though, not something I want to try. Interesting to note, however, as you can see here, the deck is actually all original, and the bridge itself, the steel structure, is entirely intact. Okay, so continuing west out of Tico, 1.5 miles out of town, here is, you can see, an old grain elevator on the left that the railroad used to serve. And this view is looking east towards Tico. Continuing on, about 6 miles west of Tico, the right-of-way went through a very deep, very long cut that, due to the shadows, is actually full of grass and other vegetation growth. Now, I did not notice any standing water or any running water. It looks to me that just because of the shade, whatever rainwater collects in there doesn't evaporate as fast, and so that's why there's a lot more vegetation growth. Now, this particular photo was taken from on top of this wooden overpass. Now, this here was probably built by the Milwaukee back when, in the 1900s, when the railroad was first built through here. The wooden bridge looks quite old, and it's still in place and still used by highway traffic. Now, one thing that is an interesting little side note here is you'll notice on the lower left corner of the picture this tree with all these red things. Well, all those little red things are actually tasty, delicious, tiny little apples. Now, in the Palouse area, there are lots of these apple trees that grow wild all over the place. And if anyone ever happens to be in the area in late fall, all of these photos were taken late September 2012, by the way. If anyone's ever here in the late fall, I highly recommend trying some of these apples. They're very, very tasty, although if you do decide to eat them, take small bites, because finding a live dead worm in your apple is gross, but finding half a dead worm in your apple is even worse. Okay, continuing 7 miles west of Tico, we get to the first of many wooden bridges that has since been removed. Now, this is a very common theme between Tico and Rosalia. There were a lot of wooden trestles in this area, not very big, but most of them have been removed. Some of them, like you see here, you can still see some of the vertical supports left. Now, 8.5 miles west of Tico is another location where normally the railroad would have put up another wooden trestle. At this spot, however, they crossed over another railroad, which was the Spokane and Inland Empire Railroad. Now, this was an electrified interurban line that ran from Spokane down to Colfax and to Moscow, and later it was purchased by the Great Northern. Now, since it crossed over another railroad at this point, the Milwaukee elected instead to build this steel truss bridge with concrete abutments. Now, in this photo here, the arrows mark the location of the S and IE grade, and back in the days when both railroads were in place, this road that the photo was taken from crossed under the S, I, and E with the SINE had a small wooden trestle that was underneath Milwaukee steel bridge, so kind of a bridge on top of a bridge here. Kind of neat little spot here, and a very lonely, forgotten place along the old Milwaukee Road. This is located at a tiny town called Seabury, Washington, Seabury. And here is a view looking through the span of that Milwaukee Truss Bridge. The concrete abutments are a ballasted deck, and the bridge itself has an open deck with the original railroad ties still in place, although wooden planks laid down for the John Wayne Rail Trail. The bridge itself, a word of caution though, does not have any handrails on it, so it is possible to fall off of it if you happen to venture on it. Just stay in the middle of the bridge because the wood deck is, in this case, is actually in very good condition. Alright, so about 8.8 miles west of Tico, there is another wooden trestle that's been removed. You can see one of the vertical supports still standing in the shadow underneath the power line there. At Fox Road, approximately 9 miles west of Tico, there is another wooden bridge that has been removed. And just beyond Fox Road here, about 9.5 miles west of Tico, here's the overall condition of the right-of-way. Kind of what you'd expect in this area and for this amount of age that it's been gone. You know, vegetation encroachment and grass growth along the right-of-way itself. About 10 miles west of Tico, just a little bit beyond that though, the right-of-way is actually in very good condition as a gravel road. And that is because this stretch of right-of-way sees fairly frequent traffic. A lot of the farmers use it to access their fields. It's a lot easier than taking some of the farm roads and driving across somebody else's field to get to their own. So that's why there's not a lot of vegetation growth here. Now, about quite literally directly in the middle between Rosalia and Tico is another removed wooden bridge at I don't know how to pronounce it, but ENGEL Road. And you can see on either side some of the wooden vertical supports remaining. 5 miles east of Rosalia, we come to another removed wooden trestle. This one was fairly tall and long, but and again you can see some of the supports remaining. Most of them have been cut flush with hillside though. And then we get to our next area, which is Pandora to Rosalia. And this is a very short little stretch here. Here's a view in Pandora, 8 miles east of Rosalia, looking east towards Tico. Now, at Pandora there was a passing siding and a few ABS block signals. However, most of this territory in what is known as the Milwaukee Road Gap was actually dark. It was unsignaled. I've heard a story about back in the Milwaukee days, there was a train that was supposed to stop at the siding but didn't, and they actually had a head-on collision a little bit east of here, and unfortunately killed a couple of crew members as a result of that. Just kind of a little, piece of Milwaukee Road history here. So here is the right-of-way at Pandora looking west towards Rosalia. Now the gravel road is the approximate location of the main line, and the cut you can see is rather wide. The siding would have been located in this view to the right of the main line. Now here is 4 miles east of Rosalia. Here is another removed wooden trestle. This one is kind of interesting though in that only the deck was removed and all of the vertical supports remain. And you can see that the center two supports are thicker. The reason for that being the center span over the farm road there was a little bit longer than the other spans. And 1.5 miles east of Rosalia, we come to the only wooden bridge that remains completely intact on this particular stretch. It is, again, a short wooden trestle. This particular one, and my assumption is that all the wooden bridges between Tico and Rosalia were like this. This particular bridge was a wooden ballasted deck, so they had this little trough here that was, in the railroad days, was full of ballast. The ballast here has been removed, and then the regular ties and rail would have been laid right on top of that ballast. And so here is looking across the deck of the bridge, looking east, and turning around 180 degrees, looking west towards Rosalia. Here's the condition of the right-of-way. And continuing on towards Rosalia, we get to a very, very large cut, and this is just on the east side of town here. Now, originally this was a tunnel. However, when Highway 195 was realigned, the railroad, since the highway realignment would have required the tunnel to be cut back a little bit, the railroad opted instead to just daylight the tunnel. Now, just on the other side of the large daylighted tunnel and the highway, we come to these beautiful twin concrete arch bridges here in Rosalia. Now, the bridge on the right crossed over the former Northern Pacific P&L line, which is still in place and still in use by the Washington and Idaho Railway. And the bridge on the left crossed over the creek, the old Highway 195, and this other branch of the Great Northern Line. The previous branch over by Seabury that was crossed was the branch down to Moscow. This branch that was crossed here was the branch to Colfax. And this bridge is just south of the town of Rosalia, and this officially ends this particular photo tour. I hope you enjoyed this little trip across this lonely plains of the Palouse of eastern Washington, and if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask.